Welcome back to the Deep Dive Learner. Right now, as you are tuning into the stream, your Neuralink interface is likely, well, it's actually highly probable that it's suffering from a 40% spike in processing latency.
Yeah, a massive spike.
Yeah,
And it's not something you notice immediately.
right. You might not feel it as a sharp pain, but you definitely feel it as a dull ache.
Exactly.
You feel it in the way you can't quite focus on a single thought, or in the way a supposedly relaxing playlist leaves you feeling like you just ran a mental marathon.
It's exhausting.
It really is. You are living in the 2026 auditory landscape, and your brain is quite literally suffocating on sound.
It is a state of constant, unbroken stimulation. I mean, the industry refers to this current era as wall-to-sound production.
Wall to sound.
Yeah, wall-to-sound.
Mm-hmm.
Every single available frequency band, every millisecond of a track, every moment of a stream is violently stuffed with layers.
There's just no empty space left anywhere.
None. The prevailing logic in the industry right now is that if you are paying for an auditory experience, the creators feel they must fill every microscopic gap with data.
Right, to give you your money's worth.
Exactly. More layers, more noise, more value. Or so they think.
Which is exactly why today's deep dive is going to challenge basically everything you think you know about how we consume media. Okay, let's unpack this. We have a stack of groundbreaking materials in front of us from the Venora's Phi research series.
Some really incredible stuff in here.
Truly. Specifically, we're looking at a multi-part research project and a series of video essays from the Solune Music Laboratory. They released this under the title The Alchemy of Absence.
It's a great title.
It is, and their core thesis is, frankly, a radical one. Our mission today is to explore how they are engineering absolute heavy silence.
But not just as a pause.
Right, not as a break in the music, and definitely not as a dropped connection. They are engineering negative space as a tangible physical instrument, one that is specifically designed to rewire how your brain processes sound.
It is a massive pivot in listening psychology. I mean, the Solune researchers aren't just pushing some avant-garde artistic statement here.
No, this isn't just art for art's sake.
Exactly. They are responding directly to that 40% latency spike you just mentioned. They are framing this entire project as a medical and cognitive recovery protocol for the modern listener.
A recovery protocol, because we are just so burnt out.
We are experiencing profound biological exhaustion. And their research suggests the only cure for this specific modern burnout is the intentional architectural application of the void.
So let's start with their manifesto, because, I mean, they do not pull their punches at all.
Not even a little bit.
They call it the Rule Breakers Manifesto, and it explicitly attacks this noise world we live in. They argue that the obsession with complex chord progressions, with 100 stem track counts and constantly full arrangements is fundamentally anti-human.
This is a strong statement.
Yeah, very strong. And they posit a formula that sounds almost absurd at first glance. They state that if an arrangement is not 90% void, it isn't composition, it's just noise.
Yeah, and that 90% metric is really where the industry pushback has been the fiercest.
I bet.
Because the current standard dictates that a producer must own the entire frequency spectrum. If the mid-range dips for even half a second...
You patch it with a synth pad.
Right, you patch it. If the high end loses energy, you inject a vocal chop or, a hi-hat flutter. So Suno is arguing that this methodology destroys the very architecture of perception.
The architecture of perception. I like that phrasing.
Well, think about visual art.
Yeah.
In visual art, negative space, the empty canvas, is actually what defines the subject.
Without the empty space, you just have a blob of paint.
Exactly. And in physical architecture, you don't live inside the load-bearing beams. You live in the empty space those beams create. The void is the habitable zone.
Okay, but translating that to audio is where my brain initially gets stuck.
How so?
Well, if I'm looking at a minimalist gallery, the white walls naturally direct my eye to the single sculpture in the center. I can easily process that. But audio is temporal. It happens over time.
Right, it's sequential.
Yeah. So if a producer strips away 90% of the auditory information, how does that not just register to the listener as a missing file? I mean, think about a smoothie. If I pay for a smoothie, I want the cup full.
Sure.
Or think about a strobe light. A constant strobe light is blinding, yeah. But if you just have pitch blackness with one single flash of light every 10 seconds, you aren't really experiencing a light show. You're just sitting in the dark waiting for something to happen.
That strobe light analogy actually perfectly illustrates the problem with wall-to-sound production. But it kind of misses the mechanism of what Solune is doing with the dark.
Okay, correct me.
You aren't just sitting in the dark waiting. The darkness in their audio isn't empty. It's an active structural element.
Active how?
When you strip away the continuous sound, you are removing the passive force feeding of information. You transform the silence from a passive void into a highly charged, expectant atmosphere. The silence becomes the primary vehicle for emotion, perception, and memory.
So the silence is actively manipulating the listener's anticipation. It's not a lack of signal, it's a signal of absence.
Exactly that, a
Yeah.
signal of absence. And to understand why your brain desperately craves that signal of absence right now, we have to look at the hard diagnostic data Solune gathered regarding the modern neural link infrastructure.
Oh man, the numbers in this report are terrifying.
You really are.
We touched on the 40% latency spike earlier, but the biological consequence of that is something the researchers term synaptic crowding.
Synaptic crowding, it's a very visceral term.
It is. Because our neural links are being bombarded with this wall-to-sound production, the auditory cortex is frantically trying to decode dozens of overlapping frequencies, microrhythms, and spatial data points simultaneously.
With zero decay time.
Zero. The neural pathways are literally backing up, creating a massive sensory bottleneck in the brain.
It is basically the biological equivalent of a distributed denial of service attack, a DDoS attack on your own auditory cortex.
That is insane to think about.
It really is. Your brain is expending an immense amount of caloric energy just to keep up with the data stream, which is exactly why you feel so profoundly drained even when listening to ambient or so-called focus music in 2026.
So even the relaxing stuff is hurting us.
Because the sheer density of the information is overriding your natural processing speed.
So, okay, if the brain is practically suffering a DDoS attack, introducing a 90% void obviously stops the attack. It gives you a break. But the Solune research goes much further than just saying, hey, giving the brain a break feels good.
Much further. They tap into a mechanism that actually repairs the crowding.
Right. They leverage a fundamental tenet of Gestalt psychology known as closure, but they apply it to neural link processing.
Yes, the closure principle.
Yeah.
The human pattern recognition engine is incredibly aggressive. It absolutely abhors an unresolved pattern.
Like it just can't stand it.
Exactly. Visually, if you see a triangle with a missing corner, your optic nerve and visual cortex work together to draw the invisible line and complete the shape. You see the whole triangle, even if the ink isn't there.
Right.
In the auditory domain, if a sequence is established and then abruptly removed, the brain does not just register the silence. It actively renders the missing acoustic information internally.
Wait. So it's not just recognizing a pattern. The brain is actively rendering the audio internally. Like it's burning its own calories to finish the song.
It is.
But that sounds counterintuitive. If the brain is already tired from the latency, why would making it do more work be the cure?
It's a crucial distinction. When the neural link forces external data into the brain, it has to be decoded, filtered, and assimilated. That whole process is what causes the latency and the crowding. But when the external data drops out and the brain relies on its own internal predictive models to render the missing notes, it completely bypasses the sensory lag of the hardware interface. Internal generation is vastly more efficient than external decoding.
Here's where it gets really interesting. By leaving the space empty, the producer is essentially tricking the listener into hallucinating the rest of the music.
Hallucinating is the precise clinical term the researchers use in the paper.
That is wild.
It is. The Solune producers provide the skeletal framework, just a few isolated, highly strategic acoustic signals, and then they just step back.
And the listener's brain just takes over.
Eager to resolve the pattern, and frankly, thrilled to be freed from the oppressive external data stream, it leaps into the void and projects its own melodic resolutions.
It completely reframes the relationship between the creator and the audience. I mean, in the wall-to-sound era, the listener is just a passive receptacle.
Just a bucket being filled with water.
Right. But in the Alchemy of Absence, the listener is promoted to co-creator. You are generating the bulk of the musical experience inside your own head.
Which leads to the beautiful paradox of their manifesto. The most powerful melody the listener hears is the one the producer refused to play.
Wow.
The emotional resonance, the actual meaning of the track, emerges entirely from the gaps.
I love the elegance of that theory. I really do. But applying it practically seems like a nightmare.
Oh, it's a massive engineering challenge.
Because if my neural link drops the audio stream for 5 seconds, I don't feel like a beautiful co-creator hallucinating a symphony. I feel annoyed.
Of course you do.
I tap my temple, I check my sync connection, I assume the packet delivery failed. How does a producer engineer a massive block of silence so that the brain accepts it as an intentional, heavy architectural space rather than just a broken Wi-Fi signal?
That is the exact engineering hurdle that took Solune years to clear. True digital silence like mathematical zero actually triggers an immediate panic response in the human nervous system.
A panic response.
Yeah. We evolved in an environment where true silence does not exist. Even if you sit in an anechoic chamber, you hear the rush of your own blood. You hear the high-pitched hum of your nervous system.
Right, there's always something.
So if a neural stream feeds the brain absolute digital zero, the brain interprets it as a loss of environmental awareness. It registers an error state.
So they have to sculpt the silence. They have to fake the feeling of natural emptiness.
They do. And the foundation of that acoustic sculpting relies on a very specific shift in frequency. Solune entirely abandoned the standard pitch of 431 hertz,
Yep.
and they tuned every single instrument in their laboratory down to 431 hertz.
Shifting the standard tuning down to 431 hertz is a massive departure from industry norms. Why 431?
It goes right back to autonomic arousal.
Yeah.
The Solune data models demonstrated that 440 hertz, particularly when it's compressed and pushed through a high-density neural stream, it maintains the nervous system in a state of hypervigilance.
It's too aggressive.
Exactly. It is a highly stimulating, almost piercing frequency baseline. 431 hertz, however, triggers a very different biological response. It resonates more closely with the relaxed state of the vagus nerve.
Oh, the vagus nerve. That controls our rest and digest functions,
Yes.
right?
So 431 hertz provides a grounded, organic sonic foundation that actively lowers the listener's heart rate. And crucially, it stabilizes the microscopic fluctuations in biosync latency.
So it sets the physiological stage. It calms the hardware before the magic trick even begins.
Precisely.
But that still doesn't solve the broken stream problem. Once you're tuned to 431 hertz and you stop playing the instruments, how do you give that void gravity?
You fill the digital zero with what the researchers call bioacoustic room tones.
Bioacoustic room tones.
Yeah. Solune engineers actually went out and recorded the ambient microscopic behavior of air inside highly specific physical spaces.
Like where?
The interior of a centuries-old wooden church, the stone resonance of a deep cave, the baffling of a velvet-lined theater.
Oh, wow.
They layer these incredibly subtle, almost imperceptible environmental recordings beneath the track. So when the active instrumentation drops out into the 90% void, you aren't dropped into a vacuum.
You are dropped into a living, breathing room.
Exactly.
You literally feel the air pressure of the space.
You feel the physical constraints of an organic environment,
Mhm.
which tells your brain, hey, the connection isn't broken, the players just stopped moving.
That is brilliant.
And to make that illusion flawless, they completely revolutionized how they handle the sounds that do exist. The 10% of the track that is actually playing,
Right.
they focus intensely on the transients.
The transients being the initial attack of a sound,
Right.
the crack of the snare drum or the aggressive pluck of a string.
Yes, in modern production, transients are usually smeared with heavy sub-bass and low-frequency saturation to make them sound larger than life.
Right, to make them hit harder.
But Solune uses aggressive high-pass filtering to strip away all of that low-frequency mud. They isolate the transient so it's razor sharp.
Yeah.
And then they apply mathematically perfect decay constants.
The ghost effect. I was fascinated by this section of the research.
It's incredible.
You have this hyper-isolated, sharp transient strike, and then the sound doesn't just cut off. The way the sound fades away is stretched and manipulated so that it dissolves perfectly into the bioacoustic room tone.
It creates a sonic imprint that literally haunts the empty space.
Yes. You hear the pluck of a string, and for the next 4 seconds of silence, you are hearing the microscopic reverberations of that single pluck bouncing off the invisible wooden walls of the bioacoustic room tone.
It anchors the listener in a physical reality. It gives the silence gravity because the silence is carrying the memory of the sound.
That is so poetic.
And practical. This is how they ensure the void feels physically heavy, like the atmosphere right before a thunderstorm. It is charged with the dissipating energy of the previous note and the mounting tension of the next one.
So we have the biology of closure, the stabilizing effect of 431 hertz, the bioacoustic room tones, and the ghost effect.
Right.
How does a composer actually sit down and write a song using this tool set? Because you can't just write a normal pop song and hit mute every 3 seconds.
You actually hit on the exact starting point. You do write the normal song first.
Wait, really?
Yeah. The composition technique is called deconstructing the motif, or building a ghost loop. The composer writes a fully fleshed out dense, melodic phrase. Harmonies, counter melodies, complex rhythms,
A traditional wall-to-sound piece.
basically. And then the alchemy of absence begins. They take a chisel to it.
They systematically delete notes.
They strip away the chords, they remove the connective tissue, they erase the bass line until absolutely nothing remains but an essential, isolated, rhythmic skeleton.
But they aren't just deleting notes based on feeling, right? There is a rigid biological metric driving the chisel.
Correct. The deconstruction is mathematically governed by the optimal 12 millisecond bite-to-sync window.
Okay, break down the biology of that specific window for us. Why 12 milliseconds?
So human auditory resolution, which is the biological ear's ability to distinguish two separate acoustic clicks, operates at about 2 to 3 milliseconds.
That's fast.
Very fast. But in 2026, we aren't just using biological ears. We are processing through Neuralink buffers.
Right.
The Solune diagnostic data reveal that under the stress of modern latency, the brain's buffer requires exactly 12 milliseconds to neatly package a sensory data point, process it, and prepare for the next one without dropping packets or triggering an adrenal stress response.
So if sounds are clustered tighter than 12 milliseconds?
The brain clumps them together into a chaotic noise block.
Wow. So by ensuring that the surviving skeletal notes of the melody are isolated and spaced, according to this 12 millisecond buffer, the producer is essentially spoon-feeding the auditory cortex at the exact speed it wants to eat.
It is absolute metabolic efficiency for the brain. But efficiency alone is boring. If you just feed the brain predictable pulses, it tunes out.
Right, it stops paying attention.
This is where the tension-release cycle of the ghost loop becomes critical. The composers take these isolated 431 Hz pulses, and they intentionally place them on unexpected offbeats.
Because if the strike lands squarely on the 1, 2, 3, 4 beat, the pattern recognition engine says, I know exactly what this is, and goes to sleep.
Exactly. By nudging the strike slightly off-center, placing it in the middle of this massive heavy void, you force the listener's brain to lean forward. What's fascinating here is how the manipulation of time becomes the primary instrument. The brain enters a state of predictive participation.
Predictive participation.
You're waiting in the charged room tone. Your brain expects the note to hit. It doesn't. A microsecond later, it hits. That tiny delay, surrounded by massive negative space, builds an incredible psychological tension.
And when it finally hits?
When the singular, cleanly filtered transient finally strikes, it acts as a neural reset. It refreshes your focus, clears the latency buffer, and prepares you for the next void. The distance between the sounds cures the cognitive fatigue.
Okay, I have to play the skeptic again regarding the distribution of this audio.
Please do.
Let's say a Solune engineer creates a masterpiece ghost loop. It's 90% room tone void, perfectly aligned to the 12 millisecond buffer, tuned to 431 hertz.
A perfect track.
Right. Then they upload it to a major 2026 streaming platform. The platform's AI compression algorithm looks at this track, sees that 90% of it is incredibly quiet, and does what algorithms do. It violently squashes the dynamic range.
It does.
It amplifies the quiet parts to hit the industry loudness standard. Wouldn't the algorithm just grab that beautiful, subtle bioacoustic room tone and boost it until it sounds like a hissing vacuum cleaner, totally ruining the void?
It absolutely would, and that was the primary reason previous attempts at minimalism failed on modern platforms.
Right.
The algorithms are designed to enforce a uniform brick of loudness.
Right. Typically targeting a specific LUFS level loudness units relative to full scale.
Exactly. If you simply turn the volume down to create silence, the algorithm applies extreme makeup gain, pulling the noise floor up and completely destroying the negative space.
So how did Solune trick the streaming algorithms into respecting the silence?
They engineer the silence to be algorithm-proof by utilizing spatial audio encoding and metadata manipulation.
Algorithm-proof silence? How?
Instead of relying on a drop in decibels, which the algorithm attacks, they encode the heavy silence as spatial panning information. They map the high-pass filtered transients to the center channel, but they distribute the bioacoustic room tones and the micro-reverb tails across an extreme, inaudible, ultra-wide stereo field.
Wait, if it's inaudible to the listener, why does it matter to the algorithm?
Because the compression algorithm calculates overall track loudness by summing the energy across all spatial channels.
Oh.
By hiding massive amounts of phase-inverted acoustic energy in the ultra-wide margins of the file, the algorithm's meters read the track as being continuously loud and full of data.
It thinks the track is hitting the LUFS target.
So it doesn't apply the destructive makeup gain. But because of how the human auditory cortex processes phase cancellation, the listener perceives only the razor-sharp transient and the heavy, pristine void in the center.
That is an incredibly elegant hack. They are feeding the machine the data density it craves in the margins, so the machine leaves the human experience in the center completely untouched.
It is a brilliant subversion of the infrastructure. They weaponized the digital format to protect the analog experience.
That's amazing. So, having established the mechanics, the biology, the physics, and the algorithmic sleight of hand, we have to talk about what this actually sounds like.
Yes.
Because a theory is just a theory until you press play. The Solune laboratory put this into practice during a 6-month creative cycle, and the methodology they used to compose the tracks is almost as fascinating as the audio itself.
It really is.
They utilized a HI-NHI collaboration, non-human intelligence.
The HI-NHI dynamic is entirely misunderstood in mainstream production circles. The prevailing narrative is one of replacement. The AI generates a track, the human takes the credit. Or the AI generates soulless garbage that clutters the network. Solune approached the non-human intelligence not as a replacement composer, but as a hyper-advanced generative instrument.
Right, the AI isn't writing the song, the AI is generating the marble, and the human is holding the chisel.
Exactly. The non-human intelligence is capable of calculating thousands of mathematical permutations of a melodic motif within seconds. It can map out every conceivable variation of a 12-millisecond buffer alignment.
Which a human could never do that fast.
Never. But it has no biological context. It doesn't know what cognitive fatigue feels like. It doesn't know what a vagus nerve response is.
It can't feel the void.
Right. So the human partner steps in to curate those permutations based on physical perception and emotional resonance. The human dictates the structure and meaning, while the system provides an impossibly vast sonic landscape to carve the negative space out of.
This collaboration yielded 3 major works, and looking at the breakdown of these symphonies really crystallizes everything we've talked about. Let's start with the first piece, Emerald Breath.
Emerald Breath is the foundational application of the theory. The research notes define its primary objective as exploring the exact moment perception begins.
I found that phrasing so compelling, the moment perception begins.
It's very evocative.
It makes me think of waking up in a pitch-black room before your eyes adjust, before you remember what day it is or what your anxieties are, just that split second of pure, unblemished readiness.
That is the exact psychological state Emerald Breath engineers. The piece operates on the principle that the silence is not empty, but rather it prepares awareness.
Prepares awareness.
The listener is submerged in a highly textured bioacoustic room tone for an uncomfortable amount of time. You are waiting. Your nervous system lowers its arousal state thanks to the 431 Hz baseline.
You're just soaking in it.
The silence acts as a sensory primer, heightening the sensitivity of your auditory cortex. When the very first sound, a singular, delicate acoustic pluck, finally breaks the void, your brain processes it with absolute crystalline clarity.
Because there's no clutter.
Exactly. It is designed to make you truly hear a sound, perhaps for the first time all day, without the interference of synaptic crowding.
It resensitizes the listener. And once the listener is awake and sensitive, we move into the second piece, which is vastly more complex, Tao Cycle Symphony.
Yes. Tao scales the Alchemy of Absence up to a 13-movement symphonic structure. Where Emerald Breath is about a singular moment of stillness, Tao is about momentum and continuous transformation.
The architecture of the piece follows the metaphor of a river, right?
Yes. Movement 1 represents the source, Movement 4 enters the flow, Movement 9 explores transformation, and Movement 13 attempts a return.
But the genius of Tao is how it handles the transitions between these movements. In classical orchestration, a movement typically ends with a definitive resolution.
A massive major chord.
Yeah, a rhythmic crescendo that firmly tells the brain, hey, this chapter is closed. It dictates closure to the listener. But Tao explicitly refuses to resolve.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, dictated resolution is a form of passive consumption. The composer is doing the emotional labor for you.
Right.
In Tao, the movements end with what the Solune researchers call open sonic horizons.
Open sonic horizons.
A melodic progression will simply hang in the air, perhaps a single viola note stretched out, decaying into a micro-reverb tail that slowly dips below the threshold of human hearing.
So the music doesn't stop, it just becomes too quiet to hear.
Precisely. And because of the Gestalt principle of closure we discussed earlier, the listener's brain refuses to let the progression die. The open horizon forces the listener to internally carry the momentum of the river through the silent gaps between the movements.
You are actively sustaining the symphony in your own mind until the external audio slowly fades back in for the next movement.
It creates a seamless, participatory flow state that is profoundly anti-fatiguing.
Which sets up the psychological threshold they crossed with the third piece. Because Tao's continuous flow state is beautiful, but what happens if you apply that same lack of resolution, that same heavy silence, to high-energy, aggressive emotions?
And that brings us to Bushido Silence.
Bushido Silence.
Bushido Silence is the most intense and arguably the most dangerous application of the void. Modern electronic music relies heavily on the drop.
Massive bass swells, aggressive percussion.
Right. Sheer volume to generate physical energy. Bushido Silence generates an incredible amount of kinetic energy through extreme, agonizing restraint.
The manifesto describes it as reflecting the quiet readiness of a warrior training to protect, not to destroy. It's the kinetic energy of a drawn bowstring held at maximum tension right before the release.
Never the release itself.
And the instrumentation they chose to convey this tension is fascinating. They heavily utilize cultural fusion.
The HI-NHI models for Bushido Silence blended traditional Eastern acoustic instruments with Western classical foundations. You have the metallic percussive pluck of a Chinese gusheng and a pipa,
Sharing the heavily sculpted void with the sustained resonance of a Western violin and a harp.
all anchored by deeply organic wooden percussion.
Picture the mechanics of that. You are in the heavy, algorithm-proof silence. Suddenly, the sharp transient of the gusheng strikes. Because it's tuned to 431 Hz, the attack is sharp, but the resonance is deeply grounded.
You hear the physical vibration of the silk and steel strings.
You hear the resonance of the hollow wooden body, and then the high-pass filter isolates it, and the ghost effect slowly dissolves that resonance into the bioacoustic room tone over 4 agonizing seconds.
The bowstring is drawn back.
Your brain is hallucinating the connective melody, desperately trying to predict the next strike to bypass the latency lag. The sheer discipline required to listen to it and the discipline required to compose it is staggering.
By using instruments that rely on physical, tactile resonance, the friction of horsehair on a violin string, the bending of wood, the movement of air, they anchor the listener entirely in biological reality.
That's so visceral.
It serves as the ultimate counterweight to the digital wall-to-sound environment.
The artistry inside the audiophile is just brilliant. But what truly makes the Solune experiment a paradigm shift is what they did outside the audiophile. They took the Alchemy of Absence and applied it to the actual mechanics of media distribution.
This is a huge part of the research.
Let's look at their structural extensions.
This is where their work transitions from music theory into media ecology. The 2026 content landscape is driven by the mandate of constant output.
You have to feed the beast.
The algorithmic infrastructure demands that creators post daily, drop a single weekly, and maintain an unbroken stream of engagement. If you pause, the algorithm buries you.
It is the wall-to-sound philosophy applied to time itself.
But Solune refused to play that game. They integrated massive, structured pauses into their release schedule. They might release Emerald Breath and then go entirely dark across all networks and neural streams for weeks.
No updates, no engagement farming.
Absolute silence.
They treated the chronological space between the releases as part of the composition, and the sociological data they gathered from this strategy is incredibly revealing.
Very much so.
In a dopamine-driven consumption cycle, withholding the stimulus usually causes user abandonment. But because Solune had primed their audience with the intense, participatory nature of the ghost loops, the silence between releases functioned exactly like the silence between the notes.
The listeners didn't abandon them. They leaned forward.
They leaned in.
The delayed releases forced a state of dopamine deprivation that actually reset the listener's reward pathways. The data showed that during these extended blackout periods, listener memory associations with the previously released tracks grew exponentially stronger.
Because they weren't immediately distracted by the next piece of content.
Exactly. The listeners had the cognitive space to actually digest, reflect upon, and form a durable emotional relationship with the art.
So by refusing to feed the algorithm, they built a deeper human connection. But wait, how did they survive the algorithmic punishment? If you don't post, you don't exist.
They survived because of the incredibly high retention and completion rates of the tracks themselves. When a listener tuned into Tao, the active, hallucinated participation required by the 12-millisecond buffering meant that listeners almost never skipped the track.
You were locked in.
The engagement metrics per listen were so flawlessly dense that the distribution AI categorized the Solune lab as a high-value data node, overriding the penalty for their low frequency of output.
They proved that profound depth can statistically outmaneuver shallow volume.
They really did.
So, what does this all mean for you, the learner, navigating the 2026 auditory landscape? It means that minimalism and negative space aren't just quirky aesthetic choices for art galleries.
Not at all.
In a world where every corporate entity, neural stream, and algorithm is fighting a war to stuff your cognitive buffer with as much data as physically possible, embracing the void is a necessary tool for biological survival.
The deepest emotional clarity, the actual cognitive recovery for a society suffering from profound sensory saturation, cannot be found by adding a new relaxation app or a different frequency of noise.
You can't add your way out of it.
No. It is found by aggressively carving out empty space. Silence is not the absence of sound. It is an active, shared perceptual space. It is where your brain finally has the room to breathe.
We've covered an immense amount of ground today. We started by diagnosing the stark reality of the 40% spike in biosync latency and the synaptic crowding that is practically DTAS attacking your auditory cortex.
The biological reality we're all dealing with.
Right. Then we broke down how the Solune researchers utilized the Gestalt principle of closure to force the brain to internally render or hallucinate the missing music, entirely bypassing the sensory lag of the hardware.
We examine the hard physics of their cure, stabilizing autonomic arousal by tuning to 431 Hz, injecting bioacoustic room tones to prevent the panic of digital zero, and utilizing high-pass filtering and specific decay constants to give the resulting silence physical gravity.
We explored the ghost loop methodology, carving away 90% of the notes to perfectly align with the brain's 12-millisecond processing buffer.
We saw how they use spatial audio encoding to hide data in the margins, tricking the streaming algorithms into protecting the quiet dynamics.
And we toured the HI-NHI collaborative fields, the sensory preparation of emerald breath, the open sonic horizons of Tao, and the agonizing disciplined restraint of Bushido Silence, all culminating in a release strategy that weaponized absence to cure algorithmic burnout.
It fundamentally changes how we interact with media, but it also presents a highly provocative question that extends far beyond your Neuralink playlists.
What's that?
If our brains are so deeply desperate to fill in auditory silences with our own internalized meaning, and if our nervous systems require that heavy negative space to heal our cognitive fatigue, what happens when we apply the alchemy of absence to the rest of our lives?
That is a fascinating point. Think about the pauses in our daily conversations. We are so terrified of awkward silences that we rush to fill them with meaningless chatter, just adding to the synaptic crowding.
We can't stand the quiet.
Think about